Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for FLA's Spring Government Affairs webinar. I'm Scott Jones, the CEO of Forest Landowners Association. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar. We are holding this as an effort to extend the opportunities to learn more about what we are doing with our public policy work at Forest Landowners Association. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your membership, your support, and engagement to help us move forward the policy agenda that we have that benefits private forest landowners. On the call today, you'll be hearing from two other staff members of Forest Landowners Association, our Vice President, Melinda Gable, and our General Counsel and Director of Regulatory Affairs, Dr. Lauren Ward. And to introduce the Government Affairs Committee and say a few words of welcome, I'd like to introduce Michael Kroll, the chairman of FLA's Government Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Scott. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Good afternoon to everyone, and thanks to you all for joining the call today. And I'd really like to start by also thanking Scott, Melinda, and Lauren, as well as the board of directors for the continued hard work and focus, regarding all the issues that impact us as members and private landowners. The relationships and really the passion that the staff and Scott show for what and who they represent is very apparent when we work with them in DC, and everyone should be very proud as members to have that group on our team. So, and really strength in numbers, that's a phrase I've used before, but it's very relevant to FLA, whether it's the number of members or the number of acres that we own as a group. These are the statistics which give us our strength. And when it comes to government affairs, I consider all members of FLA to be a member of the Government Affairs Committee, because a large amount of our successes are because of the direct results of our grassroots efforts. And it's my hope that today's update and updates like it in the future will help keep everyone engaged and provide good transparency about what the issues are and how we're working through them, what everyone can do to help, and really what are the outcomes and the successes that we've achieved so far to date. As chair of the FLA PAC, I also want everyone to know that supporting members of Congress and attending their fundraising events is a necessary part of the government affairs process, and this type of support is extremely important to keep the doors open, which are already open, and show the appreciation to those representatives and senators who share and support our rights as private landowners. So I would encourage you, if you're able, to please support the PAC as we get ready for the upcoming elections later this year and really the new Congress taking the reins in 2020. So finally, just want everyone to know that we are going to continue to fight the good fights and sincerely appreciate everyone's support to date and the interest in today's update. So thank you, and I'll pass it back to you, Scott.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Ward. As Scott mentioned, I'm General Counsel and Director of Regulatory Affairs for FLA. You can see our agenda for today on your screen. As you review it, I'd like to make everyone aware of a few of our ground rules today. Since we have a large number of folks on the line, I have all participants set on mute. If you have a question or comment for us during the webinar, please use the Q&A button to submit them in writing. You should be able to see a Q&A button in the Zoom app. It will be either at the top or bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, then try moving your mouse around and over the screen and it should appear. We'll address all of the questions that are submitted at the end of the webinar. FLA operates under an antitrust policy that you can see here on your screen. Our policy is in strict compliance with all federal laws. I have reviewed today's agenda and I do not anticipate any problems, but If anyone believes today's conversations enter any gray areas with regard to antitrust, please use the Q&A button or raise your hand to let us know, and we can address your concerns at that time.
Thank you, Lauren. To quickly review just what our vision, our mission is at the Forest Landowners Association, you can see it here, but a vision statement for an organization is your perfect world statement. And so when you think about a perfect world, when we think about it for Forest Landowners, it's really a world where we're acknowledged for the economic and environmental contributions we provide society. Now, our vision statement feeds into our mission statement, and our mission is really to ensure that we have an expanding economic climate that enables forest landowners to prosper, and those companies that to prosper from their forest resources. So we do this in really 4 different ways. And when you think about it, this is where all of our work falls into. These are the buckets that we operate in. Is really stronger markets, having regulatory certainty, good trade policy, and fair and certain taxation for private forest landowners. And we believe that by working in these areas, that in working on our mission through these areas, that if we're successful here, that private forest landowners will be ultimately successful in being able to pass their land down to the next generation, because it's still a good investment and a good business to be in. So those are the areas that we work in. So not really so important as who we are is really what we do. And so when you look at the work that we do, it really falls into these areas. We work on policy that will help promote strong markets. We promote private forest landowners and private forest land ownership, and for the attributes that they provide both to our economy and also to our environment. The places that we do this are outlined here on the next slide. We really do it in these areas. We work at the federal level, both with the administration and Congress, representing landowners to strengthen the forest land marketplace for forest landowners and the products that we produce. So these are the areas that we work in, and it's where we keep all of our focus. So I say all this with our vision, our mission, what we do, where we do it, just to put all these comments that you're going to hear from the next slides from Melinda and Lauren into context, so you remember that this is kind of who we are as an organization, and why we do the work that we do. And you would think working in these areas that it's hard to have success, but the reality is that you can still get work done. And we've had a lot of successes over the past couple of years. It's not all on our own. I'd be fooling myself if I say we carry all this on our own. We work with broad coalitions. Lauren's going to cover a few of those later on in the presentation. But a good example is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is listed there on the left of your screen. The preservation of timber tax provisions were the result of a collaborative effort amongst all the organizations that are interested in forestry and private landowners. But there were also some provisions in there that were especially important to us. The raising of the ceiling for the estate tax, and also some areas on pass-through entities, the taxation of pass-through entities. So we work collaboratively with groups on some of these larger efforts, and also look for specific places within there that we can represent your interest as private forest landowners.
Hi, this is Melinda Gable, Vice President of Forest Landowners Association. As we tee up and get into our legislative discussion, do want to just kind of comment on the importance of our FLA membership, both from the family forest landowners and the corporate landowners. You being our members enable us to really go beyond the high-level meetings that we have and the interaction we have into the grassroots. You're the constituents. You are who the members of Congress work for. And when you look at our map and our footprint across the country, what this map represents is our membership in each of the districts that they live in. And so for each state where you see green and 100%, That means for every district in that state, we have several members who are in that members of Congress district. So we have strong representation, obviously in the Southeast. Also, you look across to the Northwest. And then there's a few states where we might only have 40% of the districts covered, but generally that's going to be the urban districts where we don't have a footprint. So our footprint is very significant when it comes to grassroots. And what that provides us is a very unique position. We work our grassroots through our Forest Action Network, which is a very interactive tool on our website. When we send out call to actions, we have high engagement from our members who go to our Forest Action Network and interact by email and phone directly with the members of Congress. But we also have our GO teams, which are our grassroots optimization teams. And what that is our set to go, our state engagement teams to grassroots optimization. And if you look here on the next slide, it just kind of gives you the overview of what that strategy relies on, is having multiple individuals and teams that we've established within the states. So we have peer-to-peer delivery. When we have a call to action, we don't take it lightly. We're not sending out emails on a regular basis asking you to contact your member of Congress unless we know it's going to move the needle. And by us doing that, our members of Congress and our strong allies know that when you engage with them, it's something that we need to move the needle on. So we set up our set to go teams. They've been very successful in the past. We haven't had to use them so much under the Trump administration, except for with a few of our key priorities, which you're going to hear about today. But I really just want to say thank you, because every one of you on the call and beyond really do a great job telling your story directly to your member of Congress through our Forest Action Network. And it's commented on a regular basis when we talk to members of Congress and their staff, how we interact and how our constituency, our membership interacts. So I really want to highlight so that you realize the importance. The different ways that our set to go teams interact. I mentioned the Forest Action Network. That's the most basic way when we do the email engagement. We have a lot of our set to go team members who actually pick up the phone, and we had to use this in our Forest Recovery Act, asking directly for support, whether it's with the staff that they have relationships with or with it's that member of Congress. We have regular meetings in Washington, D.C., not only from a staff level, but with our forest landowner members coming in for congressional hearings, having one-on-one. And more importantly, in the district, that's when you really get the member of Congress attention. We have several of you have real personal relationships. So all of these are the levels of engagement we use through our set to go team, which really makes a difference when we go into our legislative priorities. So let me go over some of our legislative priorities through the legislative update. One of them that we've been focused on a lot, you know, Hurricane Michael was top of mind for a lot of people because that was the largest and most recent natural disaster. But prior to that, FLA was working on significant legislation. We know, as everyone does, that, you know, Hurricane Michael's not the last natural disaster or significant one. And we need to fix some issues that are pretty significant that impact our family forest landowners, especially when it comes to their timber crop. And I'm going to say the word crop because really when we go up on Capitol Hill and we're talking about natural disaster, we need to let them know how timber owners, timber farmers relate to some of the ag producers. But one of the major issues is the current tax code has this unintended consequence of penalizing forest landowners whose timber stands are destroyed through natural disasters. The way the current tax code currently is written, the landowner is only allowed to deduct the lesser amount of the fair market value, the cost basis, or the adjusted timber basis, which usually after 84 months, that's going to equal zero. So the lesser amount, it's not between the fair market value and your adjusted basis, it's whatever the lesser amount, and that's going to be zero. That's a really bad unintended consequence. And a lot of landowners just weren't even aware of that until this most recent hurricane. However, we had landowners coming to us and being aware of this well before that. And we introduced the Forest Recovery Act. This is the second Congress we've introduced it, introduced both in the House and the Senate. Now, this is a tax bill. When you introduce a tax bill, it has to pass out of the House in order for it actually to become law. That's the only type of issue. A tax change in the tax code has to originate in the House. So what you see here, we have 38 co-sponsors in the House. That's really where we've focused our efforts. And 38 co-sponsors on a tax legislation is a significant amount of co-sponsors. What else is significant with the work we've done and with the support from our Set to Go teams and our coalition is we've been able to get 11 Democrats on that bill, which is a significant amount. And we've also expanded that co-sponsor and that support across 17 states. So it's beyond a Southeast issue. We've had great support. That has shown when we've talked to Ways and Means staff and we've talked to the Finance Committee, they see that this is a real issue. They acknowledge it. What the Forest Recovery Act does, if you go to the next slide, you'll see really in detail. But basically it boils down to, it fixes that unintended consequence. So if you lose timber due to a natural resource, you would be able, due to a natural disaster, you would be able to deduct the fair market value of your timber instead of the lesser value. Now, if it was that you hadn't written off and the basis limited, the cost basis was the greater amount, then you'd be able to deduct this. So that is what the Forest Resources Act would do. It fixes this unintended consequence where you get nothing for the loss of your lost timber. As I mentioned earlier, we've had great support. We have over 35 organizations at the state level, the national level. Most recently, we had the Farm Bureau Association join our cause and putting out a statement from their president supporting this as well, which was great because we've seen some pickup in members of Congress co-sponsoring it from that as well. I want you to take a quick look here at the co-sponsors. If you don't see your member of Congress, please use that Forest Action Network link on the Take Action of our website and let your member of Congress know he or she should be co-sponsoring this legislation. So let me talk about the path forward on this. We're nearing the end of this Congress. It's been a tumultuous Congress, to say the least. We have a lot going on. But what's important about what we've done with the Forest Recovery Act and the number of co-sponsors and why we're going to keep pushing for support and to get more sponsors on is it's very unlikely this bill would ever pass as a single bill. We've known that from the beginning, but what you want to do is show the co-sponsorships, show the geographical support, and work with the committee staff so that if a larger tax package gets momentum and passes, that the language of this legislation would be inserted into that tax package. We've gotten good indication that that would happen. However, the likelihood of a tax package passing this Congress is not likely. But we have set ourselves up for success in the next Congress. So we will keep doing that. We will keep talking about it with the members of Congress and the staff and keep gaining support and prepare ourselves for the next Congress. As I mentioned early on, you know, this all came about just because of natural disaster and realizing this unintended consequence. We've been watching the disaster aid packages for a couple of years now. The most recent one with Hurricane Michael, which also included funding for a couple of other natural disasters in that same time frame. There's a real disconnect with the amount of money that is passed in these disaster aid packages and the amount of support and money that goes to help forest landowners. And especially in today's conversation, when forests are seen as such the solution and it's recognized the environmental benefits that you as a private landowner are providing the public, that's recognized, but when it comes down to some of the programs and the fundings, it's not. So the only line item in disaster aid package funding that really touches on forest landowner is the Emergency Forest Restoration Fund. That has been able to go from $6 million in the last disaster aid package up to $480 million. We've been happy with that. If you could take it to the previous slide, please. But we understand that there's a lot of problems with that we've heard from you. We're working on the state level with the FSA office. We're working on the regional level, And we're definitely working up here on the DC USDA level, because we know when the next natural disaster comes, these issues are still going to be there. So I just want to really convey that. If there's anyone, I know there's several of you on this call today who are having issues with your EFRP applications and frustrations, we are working with your state forestry association, with your state forest agencies, and with others to try and fix this problem, work with USDA so they're aware of it and they actually have better insights into what the problems are. So we can move forward. And this has just been our success with the Forest Recovery Act on House and Senate legislation, bipartisan support, broad coalition. We've even picked up quite a bit of media on it. And now with the climate discussion and the Trillion Trees Act, we're also getting more focus on this problem and the need to fix it. So before I leave the whole natural disaster discussion, just want to touch on block grants, because again, we are hearing from you. I get calls every week on this issue, a lot of emails, and I'm also in discussions again with our state forestry associations and our state agencies. So currently, Georgia is set with its block grants. This is the first time that money has been allocated to pay for the loss of timber. 347 million in Georgia. That's not all for timber. That's to go across all of the commodity groups from, I think it's, forget the number of counties, but from counties that were impacted from any federally declared natural disaster. Applications open on March 18th. You have a month to apply. It's likely that will be extended. I was in conversations yesterday, and that's what we're hearing. Florida is still negotiating with the USDA. So initially, we all thought it was just going to be one way it was done for all states, but now it's state by state. Florida has concern that the caps that the USDA is putting on how this money goes out to landowners, that they would have to actually turn some of the money back. USDA is saying the cap is 1,480 acres or 900,000 per timber grower. Florida is trying to say it needs to be at least 5,000 acres and up to 3 million per timber grower. So that's still ongoing. And there's a little bit of money in Alabama, and I don't have those stats up here because that's just a little bit. Hasn't been much of an issue. So that wraps it up for the natural disaster and the FRA. Happy to answer questions at the end of the webinar if anyone has any.
Thank you, Melinda. So this is Scott again. I'm going to cover where we are right now with carbon and climate change legislation. The current state of play across the country really unfolds this way. And this isn't an exhaustive list at the state level, but just an example. There is a lot of state activity going on. Of course, the California market, cap and trade, regulated marketplace has been up for quite a while. Oregon had an attempt last year with House Bill 2020 to enact a regulated marketplace, a cap and trade, where emitters could, they would set a cap on emissions that were allowed, and those that could not reduce their emissions would have to purchase offsets. This bill did pass the House of Representatives in Oregon. It made it to the Senate, and then I don't know how many people saw it, but there was a kind of a well-covered walkout of senators. The Republican senators walked out of the chamber by Senate rules. They are not allowed to take up legislation or vote if they do not have a quorum. So the governor actually called in the state troopers to go try to track down the senators to get them back in there to vote. It did not pass last year. They had a short session in Oregon this year, and there was some discussion about it, but this will come back up again. So all that to say that the regulated marketplace that exists in California might find similar traction in states, especially in the Pacific Northwest. The area that we focus on, of course, you remember when I talked about the areas we work, is at the federal level. And so it's been quite a while since we've discussed cap and trade in this country. I think it was all the way back in 2006 and 2007. Where we are now is really have two major schools of thought on how to address climate change at the federal level. So the Democrats have this goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. They're promoting that through really the lead piece of legislation is this Climate Leadership and Environmental Action for Our Nation's Future Act, which is about 600 pages worth of basically emission capping or emission reduction. And the Republicans are really focused more on carbon capture. So that's, if you really want to think about the differences or the key differences between the approaches, the Democrats are approaching it through saying, let's reduce the amount of emissions we have in this country. And the Republicans are saying, let's capture more of those emissions. And the way the Republicans are doing it is through the Trillion Trees Act, which I'm sure all of you have heard about. We had a draft copy of the legislation about 2 weeks before Westerman introduced it in the House. And we did meet with Westerman prior to the introduction. His chief of staff and legislative assistant who's carrying or really working this piece of legislation for him have been very open, communicating directly with Michael Kroll as our Government Affairs Committee chairman, and us as well as the staff of FLA, in trying to address how we make sure that markets are a part of this and that private forest landowners are duly recognized for their contributions that they're adding. The only other last comment I'll make where we are at current state of play is that there is another piece of legislation on the Senate side the Republicans have from Senator Braun, but then Senator Braun will also be carrying the companion legislation of the Trillion Trees Act on the Senate side. So here is our position as Forest Landowners Association. You can read through these, but I'll summarize is that markets and regulatory certainty are really the cornerstone of our work and our position on any climate legislation or how private forest landowners participate in climate legislation. We have, the existing carbon benefits that we provide in promoting that and making that understood, that really the life cycle of a tree for a private landowner starts when that tree is harvested. If you think of it that way, if you think about when the tree is harvested being the beginning, then you have to know where that tree is going. Where is it being manufactured? And what is that manufacturing being done for? Who's doing the manufacturing for what product? So it forces you to think of in-use markets and manufacturing. And if all of that works well together, the tree planting is a natural consequence of a healthy cycle, economic cycle for private forest landowners. If we only think about it at the time we plant the tree, then we don't think about all that work private landowners have to do to take on the risk of growing that tree and the management and the taxes on the land and everything else. So really the cornerstone of everything we talk about with climate legislation is the importance of market and regulatory certainty, and also reminding lawmakers that we as a community of private landowners plant more trees than we harvest every year. And just as important as it is to move forward to sequester more carbon using trees, it's just as important that we don't go backwards, right? So we have to make sure that those existing behaviors are incentivized through market-based incentives so private landowners continue to be growing all these trees. So the pathway forward for us, climate legislation is a big lift for everyone, and we're seeing that across the globe and even in this country, that really going alone and trying to do this as a single organization would really be short-sighted. The Forest Climate Working Group provides a great platform to work with a coalition who's all single-mindedly focused on making sure that private forest landowners and forests participate in a meaningful way in any climate legislation. You can see their goals down here. Underneath their goals, you'll see these like say it says tax treatment, equip, research. Those are the mechanisms, or an example of some of the mechanisms they'll use or they're planning to use to accomplish these goals. So maintain forest cover, make sure that private forest landowners maintain their tax treatment or the expenditures that we have right now. Advancing markets for forest carbon, creating more research on how we can do better growing these trees, and also climate data and applied science, that it's promotion of mass timber in these in-use markets. So we really felt like the Forest Climate Working Group provided us an opportunity to work with a broad-based coalition in a meaningful effort to promote the values of private forest landowners and the trees we're growing.
Thank you, Scott. This is Lauren Ward again. I'll be giving you an update on some of the advocacy and coalition building we've been doing in the area of legal and regulatory affairs, with a particular focus on regulatory certainty. Since 2014 and the proposed listing of the black pine snake under the Endangered Species Act, FLA has been highly engaged in securing regulatory certainty for forest landowners, particularly in the context of the ESA. As soon as we saw the proposed rules for this species, we knew how they would affect forest landowners from a timber perspective as well as a conservation perspective. We moved swiftly at that time because we knew the path forward had to be educating and bringing insight to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the effect of their regulations on forest landowners and their economic viability. So we launched our engagement program, holding our first forest forum with the service in 2014. Since that time, we have held countless meetings and events to engage service officials from the bottom to the top, building relationships, understanding, and trust. We use forest forums to bring a broad range of stakeholders to the table for honest discussion of problems, potential solutions, and actions we can take together to solve the problems we're facing. We use timber talks to get agency officials, policymakers, and NGO partners out into the woods to see forest management from the private forest landowner's perspective. In fact, FLA originally hired me to run this program, and I still spend the vast majority of my time cultivating these relationships, developing solutions, and building coalitions for success. The good news is that we are beginning to see the fruits of these labors. The service now comes to us as a trusted partner to ask how potential new regulations will affect our landowners before they put those regulations in place. The regulations that they are now adopting largely incorporate the flexibility and assurances that we have been asking for. The decisions that they're releasing now are setting precedents for the future for how forest landowners and their resources will be treated under the Endangered Species Act. And the relationships we've developed will endure even in the event of an administration change, as we choose to engage a broad spectrum of partners from field biologists at the local level all the way up to the director of the agency. So let's start out with a few updates on a couple of species that have a large number of forest landowners tracking them, beginning with the red-cockaded woodpecker. We've been in close communication with the service as they complete their 5-year review of this species. In June, FLA held a red-cockaded woodpecker summit in Louisiana. We invited Leo Miranda, the regional director for the Southeast region of the service, along with his staff and also some of the Louisiana state wildlife officials, on a forest tour that demonstrated what active forest management for an endangered species looks like on the ground from the perspective of a private forest landowner. The following day, we brought together a broad coalition of partners, including state and federal wildlife agencies, the U.S. Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy, National Wild Turkey Federation, and many others, to discuss a possible change in listing status for the red-cockaded woodpecker and what it would mean for the species as well as the private landowners who are its stewards. Many of the ideas emerging from this event have led to what we believe will be a favorable outcome for this species and landowners. We're currently hearing from the service that it will likely propose a downlisting of the RCW to threatened status with a flexible 4D rule for landowners. If this happens, it will be a tremendous success for the forest landowner community and one that we hope to celebrate with our members and all of our partners. The service is currently working on a species status assessment for the gopher tortoise. And this species status assessment is going to inform 2 really important decisions set to be made in the year 2022. First, whether to list the species in its eastern range, and second, whether to keep the species listed as threatened in its western range. FLA is very actively engaged in this species as well. We helped the service to develop a data request form and acted as a facilitator by sending that form to our members in the range of this species. Our members were then able to submit species data to FLA directly. Then we compiled that data, removing any personally identifiable information before passing it along to the service. So in this way, we were able to protect the interests and privacy of our landowners while also helping to boost the amount of data available for making a sound science-based decision on this species. Next, let me highlight a few species coalitions that FLA is currently a part of, beginning with the Pacific fisher. So the service recently proposed to list the fisher as a threatened species, and it shared a proposal for a 4D rule to protect the species. After this announcement was made, FLA and many of our partners in the Pacific Northwest successfully requested an extension of the comment period to allow our landowners in that area the time that they needed to submit the most up-to-date species data possible to the service. Coalition members, including FLA, also submitted substantive comments on the proposed listing and 4D rule, and we will continue to work with the service as we await their final decision on this species. The U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia recently overturned the listing of the northern long-eared bat as a threatened species. So a lot of our landowners are out there wondering, what does this mean for us? So for now, the judge has left the existing 4D rule in place, and that rule is very favorable to landowners and very lenient. So we're hoping to keep that in place as long as possible. But the judge also directed the service to go through a new species status assessment for the bat. The primary cause of the bat's decline, it's a fungal infection known as white nose syndrome, and it has significantly spread since the time of the original listing decision was made. So therefore, it is pretty likely that the bat will be listed as endangered by the service within the next few years once they complete that status assessment. So in the meantime, FLA is in close communication with a coalition of parties that has been developing a habitat conservation plan for several bat species in the Great Lakes states. And if successful, this HCP could serve as a model that could be used in other regions of the country, which will be very needed because the northern long-eared bat's range stretches across 36 states. In this way, we can provide the option for landowners to obtain some regulatory assurances in the case that the species becomes listed as endangered in the future. Many of you may have heard about the recent Supreme Court case regarding the dusky gopher frog. The Supreme Court reprimanded the service for designating critical habitat for the dusky gopher frog in an area that likely did not even meet the definition of habitat, let alone critical habitat for the species. So as a result, the service is currently developing a new definition for the term habitat, which will likely affect its application of the term critical habitat as well. So we're monitoring these developments, and we'll be working with the forest landowner community to coordinate comments on these rules when they are presented in the Federal Register. We have begun to see some promising signs of success in recent actions coming out of the service. So first of all, I want to highlight the South Carolina Multi-Species Candidate Conservation Agreement with assurances that we've been working on. This agreement will allow landowners to obtain regulatory assurances and regulatory certainty for 10 forest-dependent species in the state that are at risk of being listed in the near future. The idea for this innovative tool actually emerged from our engagement program and the ongoing series of forest forums and timber talks that we continue to hold. So through tools like this, landowners can focus on managing at the landscape level and the habitat level rather than on a very tedious species by species basis. We hope to replicate this success story in other geographies to provide efficiencies for landowners in obtaining regulatory assurances. The Louisiana pine snake was listed as a threatened species in April of 2018, and a 4D rule was proposed at that time to define which actions landowners could take without facing legal consequences under the ESA. At that time, we and several of our members and our member companies provided substantive feedback through comments submitted to the Federal Register. A year and a half later, though, landowners were still waiting for the service to finalize these rules. So FLA took action to end this period of regulatory uncertainty by leading a coalition letter urging the service to finalize the rules for the Louisiana pine snake. In December of last year, we received a letter from the service thanking us for our continued engagement on the species. And then just last month, the service took action by finalizing the regulations. FLA was particularly encouraged to see such a swift response to our request for action, as were the 15 signatories to the letter, some of whom are on the webinar today. The rule itself appears to be very fair, striking an important balance between conserving the snake while also allowing landowners to continue with most of their normal forest management operations. And last, I want to give you guys an update on the black pine snake. It's a species that FLA has been working on for several years now. It's listed as a threatened species under the ESA with a somewhat restrictive 4D rule that singles out longleaf pine stands in particular. In 2018, the service reopened comments in the Federal Register so that they could make some relatively minor administrative changes to the critical habitat designated for this species. But FLA seized this opportunity to continue to voice our concerns with the critical habitat and the 4D rule for this species. At the end of this process, the service did decrease the amount of private land designated as critical habitat by about 1,000 acres, and they directly responded to many of our concerns in the Federal Register. We look forward to continuing those conversations with them. We do expect that the service will revise the 4D rule for this species in the near future. And we've seen significant signs that the new 4D rule will be much more amenable to the needs of private forest landowners. For example, the service has already removed clear-cutting practices as a potential risk to the species. And they've also reduced their references to longleaf pine, instead replacing it with an emphasis on the pine canopy structure regardless of species types. These signs are a direct result of our engagement with the service as we continue to educate staff and leadership at all levels within the agency about forest management and the impact of regulatory language on forest landowners. Overall, our work on at-risk and listed species is on an upward trajectory. From our Black Pine Snake Forest Forum in 2014 to our Red Cockaded Woodpecker Summit to having Regional Director Leo Miranda and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director Aurelia Skipwith speak to our board of directors, FLA is out there forming relationships and building coalitions to serve our members across the forest landscape. And while some of these successes apply in specific geographic areas, these decisions are laying the groundwork to firmly establish the positive attributes of our forests for a broad range of species, ultimately demonstrating the compatibility of economic and environmental goals in forest management. Another important regulatory development is not under the ESA, but rather under the Clean Water Act that I'd like to share with you. In October of 2019, the Trump administration officially repealed the 2015 Obama-era definition of waters of the United States, or WOTUS. The Obama-era definition greatly increased federal jurisdiction over activities occurring on private lands that involved water features, meaning that you'd need to obtain a permit from the federal government to do what you wanted to do on your land. In January of this year, the Trump administration replaced the Obama-era definition with their own new definition, which provides much stricter limits on federal jurisdiction over water features on private lands. So most significantly for forest landowners, there are 3 water features that no longer fall under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. First, ephemeral streams, which flow only in direct response to precipitation. 2, man-made ditches that do not flow into a regulated water. And 3, isolated wetlands that don't touch a regulated water of the United States. FLA submitted comments in the Federal Register throughout this process, and we're really happy to see this regulatory rollback for our members. So finally, none of this success would be possible without our many partners. We engage in many partnerships throughout the forestry and conservation communities in order to leverage our effectiveness and achieve positive outcomes for forest landowners and the environmental benefits they provide. And we look forward to continuing our work with our members, the forestry sector, the conservation sector, and policymakers to promote regulatory certainty for forest landowners.
Thank you, Lauren and Melinda. We have come to that time in the webinar where we can answer some questions that you have here. Of course, this, like I said, this is one that webinar that we've just started doing this series as a way to offer you another opportunity to engage with us on policy issues. If there's something that you liked about this webinar or did not like about this webinar, all of our contact information is listed here, and we hope you'd reach out to us and let us know that so we can improve upon what we're doing. Also, if something comes to mind after we end this webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. We want to be a resource to you and your land base and your companies so that you can be successful in what you're doing. So we'd like to hear from you. Lauren, would you bring up any questions that we might have so that we can answer them?
I don't see any coming in right now, Scott, but I'll wait for a moment in case anyone is typing right now.
Okay, well, if we do not have any questions, I will thank everybody for their participation today. Thank you again for your membership and support of our work at Forest Landowners Association. And we hope that you'll reach out to us with any suggestions or questions how we can improve this process. And we hope you'll plan on joining us or extending this invitation to other folks in your area or others on your team to participate on our next scheduled webinar. Thank you all so much.